Irina and her husband lived ordinary lives. They worked, she at a school, he at some enterprise. They had a daughter. When the girl turned 4, they decided it was time for another child. A few months later, Irina became pregnant. She was very happy, as was her husband, and the grandparents too. Irina carried the pregnancy, not extremely easily, but tolerably. She remembers how they used to gather around her belly in the evenings as a family, listening to what their second daughter was doing inside. They already knew it was going to be a girl, Marina. Their older daughter would talk into Irina's belly button, then press her ear and laugh when the baby kicked back. The labor started on time. And the baby girl arrived easily. But for some reason, the doctors avoided their gaze. They whispered amongst themselves and took her away somewhere. "Your child has Down syndrome," the head of the department said some time later. Irina recounts that upon hearing this, she fainted. When she came to, she couldn't believe what was happening at first, then she just cried out loud. The doctors, in unison, urged her to give up the baby. "You won't cope yourselves, this is a sick child, they're inadequate and uncontrollable, you'll bury yourselves alive, you're still so young, think about yourselves." Irina thought, feeling sorry for herself. It seemed as though life had dealt and betrayed her. Just like that, for no reason. Giving up was frightening, but taking her home was even scarier. A sick child, uncontrollable, echoed in her head. And most of all, Irina wished her daughter had died back then. That would solve all the problems, but the girl lived. Her husband's verdict was short: "We don't need such a child." His decision was supported by the grandparents, who had recently been delighted with their little granddaughter. They left home together, just the two of them, in the evening, when it was dark. "I remember, there was a blizzard, everything was howling around," Irina said, "and it seemed to me that some child was crying after us. And my husband first walked, then just ran to the car. He fled. You know, for a long time every day, I saw in front of my eyes how we used to gather in the evenings in our past life, and the older one laughed when the younger one kicked in my belly. Then, how we left without her. And he ran away. And the child's cry stood right in my ears." They told the older daughter and acquaintances that the baby died during childbirth. Screaming silence. At home, they talked about it at first. Quietly, in whispers, so the older one wouldn't hear. She was already having a very hard time dealing with the death of the little sister she had been eagerly anticipating. They convinced themselves and each other that they had done everything right, that, the child would be better off in an orphanage. There would be activities, special specialists for the uncontrollable, doctors. Everything's right," Irina's mom repeated. What would she do among normal people? They would laugh at her, and there, everyone will be just like her, sick. And she won't be a burden to you. You have a healthy daughter, think about her, she would say every time. But one day she came, sat quietly, paused, and almost whispered, "Daughter, when your father and I get really old, will you take care of us?" "Well, Mom, what silly questions," she said, averting her gaze. Yes, her mother looked away too. Over time, it became increasingly difficult for all of us to look each other in the eye. For me, my husband, our parents, Irina recalls, it seemed like we did everything right, but it's as if we all knew something about each other. Well, never mind, we're all traitors, and we live with a traitor. It's very scary, and you want to escape, but there's nowhere to run. Her husband grew distant, coming home later and speaking less. The grandparents visited less frequently, and when they did, it was to take their granddaughter away with them. What remained were the cozy family gatherings of a happy past, picnics at the dacha, and even the mother-in-law stopped inviting them to dig potatoes. Everything disappeared, even the conversations about doing the right thing. What remained was screaming silence. Months passed, but there was no peace, Irina said. I stopped sleeping properly, tossing and turning at night. I had nightmares. My husband went to the couch, groaning and sighing. I know we both thought about the same thing and stayed silent. Irina started searching online for stories of families who had abandoned special children. One day, she stumbled upon a forum for parents of refusers. She read it, and it made me feel even worse. I felt that they were suffering just like me, but were desperately trying to justify themselves. At least in their own eyes. Will I ever be able to forgive myself? I understand what she's talking about. 2 years ago, I learned about these forms too. A friend sent a link to one of them. And I felt so sorry for those parents, it brought tears to my eyes. I read and my heart bled. I always wanted to know how families who had abandoned their children were living. Then I realized, they're living in hell. Every day, every minute, every second, they're in hell. Already here, on earth. There are crosses that some people can't bear. The burden of having a sick child can be very heavy, but sometimes there might be someone nearby who will pick it up and carry it with you, making it easier. Some people carry it lightly. It happens. But reading all this, I realized that there is one burden that is too heavy for anyone. It's the burden of betraying your own child. Raising a disabled child can be hard, unbearable, but abandoning them and living peacefully is impossible. With horror, I understood then that these people would never be able to sleep peacefully, just like Irina. And they themselves understand it. They are unable to take the disabled child back, nor can they forget about them. I could never live with such a child, and just 2 lines later, I couldn't even bear to think of how they are there all alone. They justify themselves, trying to prove something primarily to themselves. They search the internet for horrifying videos where disabled children are shown in the most terrible light. They write that they could never raise such a child. No money, no strength, no helpers, nothing else. For many years after abandoning their child, they visit the orphanage to convince themselves that it's better for them there, but they don't believe it themselves. They understand that there is no going back to their old life. That's the true depths of despair, the gnashing of teeth, eternal torment. The most common question that echoed there was, will I ever be able to forgive myself? They themselves understand that they won't be able to. It wasn't enough for Irina. And she started to visit her daughter secretly, so her husband wouldn't know when there was no one to hug. At first, she would come and just talk to the staff. She couldn't bring herself to look at her daughter. But then she decided. I hoped I would see someone else's child, not mine, who had already gotten used to other people. But she was so much like me, she was my daughter. I pushed that thought away from me, but she was mine, my eyes, my eyebrows, she even frowned the same way. I looked at her and saw myself. I didn't want to, but I saw. I ran away then. But Irina couldn't run away from herself, although she convinced herself that there were professionals in the orphanage and that the child would be better off there. She kept coming back, and her daughter was developing well. She smiled, held her head up, rolled over, sometimes cried, and then stopped. She would stare at the ceiling. And in her eyes, just like her mom's, there was sadness. What's wrong with her? Irina would ask. The staff shrugged, and only the elderly cleaner once said, why bother? She realized that she's unwanted. And there's no one to live for, to develop for, to strive for. Why reach out if there's no one to hug? Who to smile at? In the evening, Irina told her husband that she wanted to take their daughter back. Yes, he replied softly. For the first time in many months, they chatted about something over dinner. Certainly, everything was slipping from Irina's hands, but there was a viscous, sticky sorrow that lingered somewhere. At night, her husband came to sleep not on the couch, but in their damp bed. The burden of betrayal was gone. For the first time in this period, they fell asleep in each other's arms. There was a reliable person beside them, now everything would be fine. They hadn't had time. They didn't know how to explain it to their older daughter, how to tell their parents. It was scary, but also easy. Life returned. They picked out toys, clothes. Everything they had bought before, after the birth, they gave away immediately. They prepared, collected some documents, visited their little girl together. They hadn't had time. Their younger daughter died of pneumonia. She was gone within a week. "It's our fault, I know," Irina wrote to me. "If we hadn't abandoned her, she would be alive. She would be happy. It's me. I wanted her to die in the maternity hospital. And now she's dead. My daughter is dead. It was such horror. I'll never forgive myself. Never." It was hard for her husband too. He didn't withdraw, but he spoke less. He was thinking about something. But one evening, he approached Irina and said, "Let's take in such a girl. I saw her in the database. She looks a lot like you. And like her." Right now they are collecting documents. Soon, their older daughter will have a younger sister she has dreamed of. Maybe not quite ordinary, not like other children, but loved and happy. They set off, the grandparents clapped their hands. Irina's mom even shed a tear, then hugged her. "Do as your heart tells you. I've worn myself out, we'll love her." And Irina's dad brought dumbbells from somewhere. "You'll need a lot of strength for the second granddaughter. Grandpa must be strong. She has grandma's stubbornness, life is like that." Yes, the light was on late in their house. This house was finally calm. It was warm inside, and most importantly, honest. Everyone was together and could look each other in the eye. They talked, drank tea. They still bled with pain and guilt from the heart. And it will always be like that. There's no escaping it. But now there's meaning and hope that all this is right, if they are happy. It's certain because God is near. He was in the eyes of that girl. Just like her mom's. He cried with the voice of that child Irina heard. He longed when he was unwanted. He was in their hearts when they slept in each other's arms, determined to make things right, and guarded their sleep. He died with the girl and was born again when he heard, "Let's take in such a girl." He hugged Irina with her mom's hands and handed the old grandpa the dumbbells. And now he's in that house where the warm light shines outside the windows. He's always there, always, in every moment. Every moment.